To say that 2020 was just a bad year is one of the biggest understatements of the last century.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The fans here in the arena don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. And so, as soon as we get any kind of information, we will certainly pass it along.
The game tonight has been postponed. You're all safe.
We're fully mobilizing the National Guard for the first time in U.S. history. The protests continuing this evening. These pictures coming in right now from Los Angeles. Police pushing back crowds, using batons and firing rubber bullets. A patrol car on fire.
Yeah, we're into this. And you know, now we're at the mercy of whatever this eye wall is going to do as it comes up the end. It's good, believe it or not, it's going to get worse. We know that we've had gusts over 120 miles per hour down in Cameron. We know we've had gusts now almost 110 miles an hour in Lake Charles as well.
A global pandemic, along with a massive amount of unrest and uncertainty, put billions around the world on constant edge for the next bad thing. What was also incredibly problematic was the extreme weather that occurred. There was a hyperactive hurricane season, temperatures reached record highs, and in many places across the United States, the weather seemed off in another way. Other than a couple of tornado outbreaks in the Deep South, there really wasn't that much severe weather. As the months went on and as 2020 continued, the concerns of many across the Midwest were not of the weather, but of health and safety for obvious reasons. This would change on August 10th, as something was brewing in the Great Plains. Early that morning, a cluster of thunderstorms began to organize in South Dakota and Nebraska, as they didn't initially seem like it would mature into something more than just your average 60-mile-per-hour thunderstorm complex. However, as the day got hotter and the instability in the atmosphere grew to alarming levels, this cluster of thunderstorms would start to rapidly intensify. By the early afternoon, much of Iowa was now at the mercy of up to 140-mile-per-hour winds as an unprecedented derecho was about to annihilate the final piece of normalcy in 2020.
A very intense thunderstorm that is ongoing right now. There have been reports of substantial damage around Tama County, and the National Weather Service is saying winds are possibly near 100 miles an hour or higher.
Oh my God!
The last thing that many of you would expect about 2020 was that a massive derecho destroyed much of Iowa and Illinois and produced tornado-scale damage that affected millions of people. However, on August 10th, meteorologists and those affected alike remember where they were when it happened. This derecho was such a catastrophic event that it affected not just a town, but the entire Midwest, and it would result in billions of dollars of damage and lost produce. Today, we take a deep dive into how such an event came to be and how this went completely under the radar for meteorologists until it was right over them. I will be going over everything that happened in this derecho, from the weather conditions to the derecho itself and the brutal aftermath for those affected. The days leading up to the derecho were of uncertainty and confusion for many meteorologists both inside and outside of the Storm Prediction Center. This was the case where pretty much every single forecast model and analysis failed to grasp the full scope of the conditions present in the Midwest until it was too late. As we look at the conditions in retrospect, there were some signs that something big could happen, but there were also many things that completely caught those who were forecasting off guard. The first thing that was evident was the temperatures in the mid-80s across Iowa, which is typical for the Midwest in the morning on a hot summer day. However, another thing that was noticeable was the dew points were in the mid-70s across Iowa and northern Illinois, allowing for a moist environment with humidity in the upper 80%. These factors led to a large amount of instability, which allowed for convective available potential energy to skyrocket. Initially anticipating less than 1,000 joules per kilogram for the region, many were surprised for the Cape to surge to between 2,000 to 2,500 joules per kilogram, which is a healthy amount of instability needed for severe weather to initiate. But the final factor that caught many off guard was the wind shear, which was not particularly that high. The wind shear values only got up to 30 knots at 6 kilometers above the surface, which is decent if you want an average severe thunderstorm, but not much more than that. So this raises the question, what was the factor that allowed for such a scenario to happen? The answer to that question was the orientation of the fronts that day. On the night of August 9th, a warm front surged through much of the Midwest and Great Plains, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, the front had moved past Wisconsin and crossed into Canada. This allowed for a gigantic cold front attached to a low pressure system to start to barrel towards the Great Plains. Let me ask you a question. What do you think happens when warm, moist air crosses paths with much colder and much drier air? Does it A, just make it colder and move on? B, fizzle out and allow for the warm air to stay there? C, create a lot of forcing resulting in an unstable air mass that allows for severe convection to form and develop before hitting an entire state and destroying everything in its path? Or D, literally anything that is not C? You have some time to think about it. Okay, time's up. It's C. Anyways, there was a massive cold front that would be the catalyst for allowing a small amount of weather to form in the early morning hours of August 10th over parts of the Great Plains in South Dakota and Nebraska. These storms were not noteworthy at the time, but as the hours continued and the morning sun began to rise, the storms began to make their way over Iowa and areas deeper into the Midwest. The question now was how was the SPC going to handle this situation going forward, and how their actions so far would result in what was to come. The days leading up to the derecho were some of the most challenging days at work for those at the SPC, as they had to determine the threat level and where this threat level would occur with the little information they had. The Day 3 outlook on August 8th only had a marginal risk of severe weather from Kansas to Michigan, with the threat of 60-mile-per-hour winds possible, but overall shouldn't be worse than an everyday storm. Knowing what we know now, it is easy to criticize the SPC for not catching on sooner, but to be fair, they were going off of very little information, and there was so much conflicting data that they were doing the best they could with what they had. The Day 2 outlook had a slight risk for parts of Kansas and Missouri, as the threat level looked to be increasing as some more data was coming in, but could not form a conclusive picture of how this could possibly pan out. However, the threat was not in Kansas or Missouri at the time, as the warm front blitzed through the United States much faster than everyone anticipated that day. By the time the next outlook for August 10th came out, the threat level had shifted hundreds of miles to the north, with the greatest threat now over Minnesota and Wisconsin. Throughout all this time, Iowa was kept out of the greatest threat mainly due to conflicting information, as well as a very strong cap, which is a stable area in the atmosphere below the Cape-driven instability. This cap was set in place during the night of August 9th, as it was the primary reason that the threat level was misanalyzed until the cold front began to move through the Great Plains. But then, the threat level at 7 a.m. by the SPC was literally, once again, analyzed hundreds of miles to the south, with the greatest threat now over Missouri and Illinois. This almost seems like a comedy scene at this point, as the risk was originally over Kansas and Missouri, then moved hundreds of miles to the north to Minnesota and Wisconsin, and was now back down to Missouri and Illinois. However, once again, this was due to conflicting data, and the SPC was working off of what the most consistent information was. As this was going on, the storms were developing and were about to enter Iowa, where the conditions were ripe for development, and with a forcing boundary included in the cold front, the cluster of thunderstorms began to form into a line, and the first severe thunderstorm warnings were issued. These severe storms became better organized and coalesced into a pronounced squall line, producing hail of diameters between 1 and 2 inches with wind gusts between 60 and 70 miles per hour. Storms were developing quickly, and by the time the storms reached the western Iowa area, every NWS office in the state was on high alert, as the derecho was moving along the cold front that was pushing the storm complex to speeds of over 50 miles per hour. In response to these developments, the SPC issued a special outlook at 8 a.m., issuing an enhanced risk of severe weather for parts of eastern Iowa and western parts of Illinois. According to the SPC, there was now a 30% probability of winds or wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. The derecho moved through Sioux City, Iowa, and heating associated with the sun made for warmer conditions near the ground, allowing for further strengthening and stronger wind gusts reaching the surface. At this time, the derecho had winds of around 70 miles per hour, and many people were experiencing major wind damage and power outages. This really wasn't helped by the fact that these winds were lasting longer than 20 minutes in some areas in western Iowa. At the same time, some of the derecho's winds spread outward from the storm, spreading to the south and southeast and causing damage over 50 miles away from the storm in areas where rain was not falling. Around 9 a.m., the derecho began to explosively intensify from a squall line of thunderstorms into a full-blown wind-driven nightmare. Wind gusts began to surge as reports of 80 and then 90 mile per hour wind gusts began to trickle in as it crossed into central Iowa. The derecho then crossed into Des Moines and Ames, where the first horrific signs of what was to come occurred. Des Moines was about 20 miles south of the worst winds, but a wind gust of 75 miles per hour was recorded in the city. Areas south of Ames were in the brunt of the derecho, receiving over 100 mile per hour winds as the derecho crashed into the area and caused extensive damage. As this was going on, the SPC issued a particularly dangerous situation severe thunderstorm watch for much of eastern Iowa, northern Illinois, and southern Wisconsin. This PDS watch called for the threat of widespread 100 mile per hour wind gusts or greater with this derecho, and the possibility of several tornadoes embedded in the derecho. 5 minutes later, the SPC issued a moderate risk of severe weather for similar areas due to the immediate threat of these wind gusts. A 45% hatched wind threat was what was warranting this risk, due to the derecho expected to continue through much of Illinois and southern Wisconsin. As the situation was going from bad to worse, a mesoscale vortex developed on the northern edge of the storm, which allowed for the storm to attain a bow-like structure in central Iowa, where the strongest winds were within the shape. As this development was going on, Marshalltown was getting hit by over 100 mile per hour winds by this blowing derecho and suffered catastrophic damage due to Category 2 equivalent hurricane force winds moving through the town. These wind gusts lasted 30 minutes to an hour, and that kind of punishing strength would result in an equal, if not worse scenario than the 2018 EF3 Marshalltown tornado that barreled through downtown. After this, the derecho continued to strengthen, with wind gusts of over 120 miles per hour now being recorded as it approached Cedar Rapids. The Boeing section was where the strongest winds were, with a combination of storm speed and downdrafts resulting in a worst-case scenario. The Boeing section was now moving at around 65 to 70 miles per hour, compared to around the 50 miles per hour the rest of the derecho complex was moving. This forward motion allowed for faster wind speeds due to a stronger mesoscale pressure gradient. The derecho was now approaching the Cedar Rapids area with 140 mile per hour winds, and with the approaching storm, an eerie calm persisted. Across the derecho path, An eerie calm before the storm happened, and as the winds began to pick up, there was a 20-degree drop in the span of only a couple of minutes. As the derecho began to enter the Cedar Rapids area, this calm persisted, and not many people there realized that they were about to get the worst of the storm. For over 40 minutes, Cedar Rapids and the surrounding areas, including the community of Marion, where the strongest wind gust of 138 miles per hour was recorded before the anemometer was knocked offline. In that time, entire neighborhoods were destroyed as roofs were torn off, trees completely uprooted, and in some cases, entire homes were destroyed. The damage in this area was apocalyptic, as Category 4 hurricane equivalent winds destroyed communities that were not built to sustain anywhere near those wind speeds. This is not like a tornado either, where the wind speeds accelerate incredibly fast and then decrease after 30 seconds and affect a narrow path. This derecho affected an entire region, and to some, it was a Midwest hurricane. The derecho would keep going as it approached the Quad Cities region and the Mississippi River. At this point, severe thunderstorm warnings issued encompassed massive areas, including entire counties as it pushed eastward. These warnings consisted of winds that would exceed 100 miles per hour in some areas and urged those to seek underground shelter if necessary. At this point, however, the derecho had started to weaken slightly, but was still insanely strong as wind speeds were still over 100 miles per hour across eastern Iowa. However, as the derecho approached Illinois, the max wind speeds decreased to about an average of 90 miles per hour, but one area of 120 mile per hour gusts was recorded east of Cedar Rapids. The Quad Cities suffered a direct hit, with the wind gusts of around 90 miles per hour recorded for the region as the storm complex crossed into Illinois and Wisconsin. One final area of wind gusts over 120 miles per hour was recorded on the Iowa-Illinois border as it was crossing the mighty Mississippi, and from there, a new threat would emerge. Due to stronger directional wind shear and the orientation of the northern half of the derecho, the threat for tornadoes embedded into the complex began to increase. As it began to approach the Chicago area, tornado warnings began to go out. Over a dozen embedded tornadoes would touch down in the span of an hour in the Chicago suburbs, as the derecho's wind speeds were gradually weakening as the complex pushed outward and extended hundreds of miles further south. Areas that would be affected by the derecho include St. Louis, Springfield, Illinois, and Indianapolis, as the complex would start to lose its severe characteristics as it pushed through Indiana. Regardless, wind speeds of over 70 miles per hour were still affecting much of the Chicago area and Indiana as the derecho pushed eastward. These are some photos that were taken by some of my friends that were in northwest Indiana when the derecho was ongoing, and the complex before the storm hit was one of the best I have ever seen from a derecho. Even as this derecho was already weakening, the structure of it remained mainly intact in that area, and these shots are, in my opinion, some of the most incredible weather photos to look at. The derecho continued into the evening as it moved through Indiana, and the northern part crossed Lake Michigan and affected the southern part of the state. The environment had finally become unfavorable to sustain such a monstrous storm, and by 7 p.m., the derecho had stopped producing severe winds of over 60 miles per hour in northwest Ohio, marking it the end of one of the most historic and destructive storms in the Midwest. It cannot be understated just how much devastation this derecho caused in its over 700-mile path. In total, over $11 billion of damage occurred with this derecho, making this the second costliest natural disaster of 2020, with Hurricane Laura taking the first place spot. This was by far the costliest derecho in U.S. history, exceeding the previous placeholder, the 2012 Mid-Atlantic derecho, by 5 times the amount. The vast majority of this destruction was to the agriculture industry, as countless amounts of crops were destroyed by this derecho, as 14 million acres of corn and soybeans were in the derecho's path in Iowa alone. To put that in perspective, that is 2/3 of Iowa's crops that were either damaged or destroyed in the state that is the top producer of corn and soybeans in the country. Because of this derecho, Minnesota would become the largest crop-producing state in 2020. Which just goes to show how much food was decimated by the storm. The derecho also leveled many farms and buildings that were going to store the new harvest. An estimated $9 billion of crops were lost by this derecho, and the cleanup effort would take months due to the extreme scale of the damage that occurred. In the communities that were affected, there were varying levels of destruction. In western Iowa, there was some damage that occurred in the region, but due to the derecho still just forming and not at peak intensity, the damage was limited to mostly minor to moderate home damage outside of crop loss. In central Iowa, particularly around Marshalltown, the damage was extensive and widespread. Many homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed by over 30 minutes of over 100-mile-per-hour winds, and many trees were either snapped or completely uprooted as the derecho moved forward. Numerous injuries occurred with the storm, and Marshalltown sustained tens of millions of dollars in damages due to the storm. But just like they did after the 2018 EF3 tornado, they began to rebuild and recover with assistance from the state of Iowa and the federal government. But by far, the worst area impacted was the Cedar Rapids area. Cedar Rapids suffered a direct hit from 140-mile-per-hour winds that were in the bulge of the storm. These winds resulted in apocalyptic damage across the area, and Benjamin Carell, the Adjutant General of the Iowa National Guard, said that the damage in Cedar Rapids was worse than what he saw with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Many others in town compared it to the destruction of the 2008 Iowa flood, where Cedar Rapids suffered extreme flooding from the Cedar River overflowing its banks due to multiple rounds of snow, rain, and severe thunderstorms in the 6 months leading up to the flooding. Many communities in Cedar Rapids were destroyed, with entire neighborhoods sustaining extreme property damage from the winds. Tree damage was quite extreme as well, with some large trees being completely uprooted and landing onto people's houses and causing major structural damage to those that were struck. Hospitals that were running on backup generators admitted hundreds of people who were injured in the derecho due to debris. In total, 4 people were killed in the derecho, and officially over a dozen were injured due to the direct effects of the derecho. However, this number is almost certainly much higher due to the hospitals across the state admitting hundreds of people that were injured by more indirect means. These range from falling trees, debris from homes, and other factors of varying levels. The official response to the derecho, compared to other disasters of this scale, was incredibly slow and overall difficult to get the ball rolling. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds declared a state of emergency on August 11th, but it took nearly 48 hours for the National Guard to get involved. This was partially due to the lack of communication between the communities affected and the governor's office, as the Iowa electrical grid was heavily damaged and there was no power or internet connection for those who were affected for up to 2 weeks. However, as communication lines were restored, the urgency of the situation was soon realized, and on August 16th, Reynolds formally requested a presidential disaster declaration and $4 billion from President Donald Trump. President Trump approved part of the request, totaling $45 million for 19 counties, while an amended declaration for Cedar Rapids and Lynn County was approved on August 20th. Throughout September, the rest of the counties were approved for the federal disaster declaration by FEMA. This shockingly slow response by all parties involved was heavily criticized, as such a major disaster requires immediate and effective response time and management. The attitude of this response from those affected, especially in Cedar Rapids, was too little, too late, as it took nearly 2 weeks for major help to arrive. In the following months, the communities affected would clean up the debris and begin to recover from this historic derecho, as many communities, still to this day, are recovering and rebuilding. I hope you enjoyed this documentary. I remember watching this on TV while this was happening, so I figured that it needed an overall review of what happened and why it got so strong, as well as why it was so historic. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more documentaries like these. It helps me produce more of this style of video, and it is very much appreciated. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe.